All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I know we'll have a number of people who'll be joining us here or who may be watching this presentation offline. My name's Patrick von Schlag. We don't have a lot of time together and wanted to take a few minutes today to talk to you about a holistic approach to think about cybersecurity risk management. So we're going to talk about digital value management systems, and we're going to show you how this helps your organization establish an overlay that helps you look at your organizational capabilities, regardless of your organization's size or scale, and to be able to incorporate these practices in a way that help you adopt and adapt cybersecurity frameworks like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and help your organization to start thinking about how value is created and protected together. So I work with a lot of different organizations to help wrestle with some of the fundamental challenges of actually doing cybersecurity risk management at an enterprise level and really at an organizational governance level, right? To make the decision to use this framework means that we're moving our focus beyond one of pure compliance to help an organization effectively manage risk. Given the nature of the business capabilities that they have, the organizational structures that they use, and their organization strategies, how do they effectively align and integrate risk so they can best optimize their capabilities, given the nature of the work that they do? So one thing that we're going to introduce in here is this idea of an overlay. Right? All these organizations, whether you're very large or very small, have a set of different types of organizational capabilities, some more mature, some less. And ultimately, the question really becomes, how much capability does your organization need, given your size, given your scale, given your organizational strategic goals and competencies, in order to be able to meet minimum viable capabilities to be able to deliver on your organization's objectives. So we can think holistically about this in terms of how we establish organizational governance, how we apply and provide certain levels of assurance, how we plan organizational capabilities, design new and changed service capabilities, successfully manage transition and change, successfully execute against our goals, and to be able to identify and drive different levels of innovation. Now, your organization may be using any number of different service management capabilities, governance approaches, and so on. And we're not suggesting that you should replace any of those, but that we can use this approach as an overlay to look at what it would take to do a gap analysis and assess your organization's minimum viable capabilities that you would need in order to be able to meet certain organizational goals. Right? As you start looking at each of the capabilities, we introduce what is called a digital value capability maturity model. Right? What is our relative level of organizational capability around aligning strategic and organizational governance and policy and strategy goals to our operational capabilities to create and execute organizational capabilities, both to deliver digital business services and to be able to successfully protect them. In order for your organization to be able to successfully integrate cybersecurity risk management into your overall digital value approach, requires you to think about this stuff holistically, based on your organization's specific internal strategies and goals, based on the external legal and regulatory requirements you're subjected to, and of course, subject to the complex sets of vulnerabilities, threats, and risks that we face that are continuing to evolve. What is the organization's relative level of maturity in being able to maintain this alignment between the organization's strategic objectives and what we do to provision and deliver services, and to be able to successfully create, protect, and deliver on the organization's digital business value goals? So with all that as a premise, we introduce in the courseware and in the book for the NIST Cybersecurity Framework Practitioner Guidance, we introduce what is called a CPD model, create, protect, and deliver. It is a complex system of systems. And the intent is to describe and use as an overlay how we look holistically at an organization and what kinds of things we might need to think through in order to understand how the various interactions among many sets of complex systems in an enterprise actually work together to help us deliver on certain goals, and how we can use this information to identify and prioritize investments and commitments to deliver better results, right? It should help us ask different kinds of questions. What's working, what's not working, what other kinds of things we could or should do to help our organizations to achieve these objectives more effectively. So I recognize that this is a very complex looking model. Let's decompose this a little bit and look at some of the pieces of this. And again, you can look at books like A Practitioner's Guide to Implementing the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It's published by TSO. It's a really good book to help people kind of think about, okay, so what do we actually need to do here in order to start thinking about applying these capabilities? So one of the broader premises that this all is underpinned by is that we have two different broad perspectives when we work in complex systems. At one level, we're doing work. We're carrying out work, we're delivering capabilities, we're delivering results. We are working within the system that we're in. Right? And so as we are working in the system, we identify and execute, we drive performance, we may identify various improvements to how the system performs to help it gain efficiency and effectiveness, make it work more effectively than we did before. But it's often more useful to be able to look more broadly outside the system, to be able to work on how the various different organizational capabilities, how the various interactions affect what we do, right? Do we have the right sets of organizational capabilities? Do we have the right people and knowledge and skills? Do we have the right practice disciplines? Do we have appropriate underpinning tools and technologies? Do we have a culture that will help support the broader sets of goals that we have? And then we want to be able to think about this from different points of view. If I'm an implementer of cybersecurity controls, what do I have to do? How do I actually go build controls, build capabilities to actually go execute on this? If I'm an auditor, how would you demonstrate evidence that this actually works, that it actually produces the results that we want, and that it is in fact actually performing as expected? Right? So these two roles really must work together in order for us to be able to effectively build and then provide appropriate assurance that in fact our controls are meeting the goals and that our system can successfully create and protect the digital business services that we deliver. So let's look at the CPD model. It is a system of systems. Right, so there are 5 effective subloops that are kind of baked together into the overall approach. And again, you can use this as an overlay for any size organization, big or small, to be able to look at your existing governance approaches, your existing executional models, your existing ways of doing assurance and validation, and then to be able to ascertain whether or not you're actually getting the results that you really want from the capabilities that you have. Let's look at each of the 5 circles. So the first of them, the one around the outside, we call the governance and assurance loop, right? This, of course, begins from an organizational perspective at the very top, the board of directors or whatever the senior most governing body is. Right, it's their job to establish organizational strategies, to establish broad organizational policies that we are expected to follow as we execute strategies. These should be reflected in how and what kinds of metrics and measures we might use for the purpose of converting these strategic goals into operational intent. What are we going to have to go do operationally to go deliver on those objectives? Right? As we perform and execute and deliver services, how can we then provide assurance and feedback to the strategic level of the organization that we are, in fact, meeting the organization's strategic needs? So we need to think through how this information flow is going to work. From the time we establish a set of strategic goals, a set of risk profiles, down to through execution and back up again. How do we provide meaningful levels of assurance that our strategies have been successfully executed and delivered, and that we are providing, in fact, assurance that we are delivering what we were supposed to? Next key piece here we might call the strategy enterprise risk management loop. In this book, we establish this premise that strategy and risk are not really different things. They're two halves of the same coin. I can't achieve organizational goals without managing both of them in parallel, right? And any particular business case for an organizational capability fundamentally has to balance cost and risk with value and outcome. How do we ensure that our organization, in fact, establishes strategies that are risk aligned and risk aware? In a digital business universe, this is fundamentally about digital business risk, which means that our ability to create digital business value is dependent on our ability to protect it at the same time. That you can't really have it unless you protect it. So in the book, they introduce this notion of strategy risk, right? And that strategy risk describes a set of broad organizational strategic intent. Strategic goals we want to achieve, risk activities we have to be able to coordinate and manage to be able to deliver on those strategic objectives. From there, we can start looking at a broader loop around strategy and governance. And so here we want to be able to take our strategic goals and we want to be able to begin the process of aligning that to how, in fact, we're going to create and execute as an organization. All right, so you see to the right the idea of QOQM, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the basic idea is I have to be able to establish organizational strategic goals, and I need to be able to align them in a meaningful way to operational goals and objectives, and to be able to establish what key measures and metrics we'll use to ascertain whether or not we're actually doing what we're supposed to be doing, right? This should be driven by various types of organizational capabilities, many of which we, of course, already have, others of which we may need to create or improve in order to meet the organization's strategic objectives. From there, of course, it really is about execution, right? So how do I take strategic goals, convert them into operational goals, and then go about the process of building and provisioning organizational capabilities that we can then execute on in a way that helps us deliver benefits, that helps us establish how we're going to measure performance of work, so that we can demonstrate that, in fact, we did the things that we were supposed to do, and that we, in fact, delivered on those goals, or perhaps did not, and then use that to trigger various types of improvements or innovations that we might need to do in order to help better improve organizational performance, to be able to better deliver digital business capabilities, and to be able to better protect them as we go. Within Governance Execute, we have a specific loop that describes value and performance. As we execute and deliver value for stakeholders, we also at the same time need to be able to successfully protect that value. So you'll see here that this entire approach drives cybersecurity risk management into the entire approach from strategy through execution in how we do what we do. Security can't be treated as a bolt-on or an afterthought, because the idea of establishing digital business value is fundamentally aligned with managing digital business risk, right? And therefore value creation and value protection have to go hand in glove, right? As we execute and we deliver on digital business capabilities, of course, we're measuring performance, right? Is that performance in line with expectations? Obviously, we're doing the performance measurements based on the measurements that we established when we looked at our strategic goals and then looked at how we were going to coordinate those and align those with operational intent. This, of course, may then drive feedbacks for various types of improvements. It also drives information back for assurance purposes, right? Are we, in fact, demonstrating that we are, in fact, successfully executing on the strategy risk goals? So let's take a minute to talk about that little bubble on the right-hand side, right? We call this question outcome question metric, and it's an outgrowth of a very well understood metrics framework called goal question metric with an extension called goal question metric strategies. It was created by Dr. Basili at the University of Maryland a number of years ago, has been updated and evolved many, many times over the years. And what it does is it helps us think about how we're actually going to know if we meet strategic goals and how do we convert strategic goals and planning into operational intent and action. What do we need to do within an organization, both to create digital business value and capabilities and to be able to successfully protect them? So QOQM helps us look at our strategic goals and then asks us to take certain perspectives. From a particular point of view, what are the key questions I'd want to answer in order to know whether or not I achieved a particular goal, right? And so you can think about this very specifically as someone working in cybersecurity risk management. If I implement controls, what kinds of questions would I want to ask and answer to know whether or not this control delivered on its objectives, right? If I were an auditor, what kinds of questions might I want to ask? What kinds of evidence might I want to see to be able to demonstrate that it, in fact, provided the particular control capabilities that it was supposed to, that it actually worked as it was intended? So by bringing different perspectives to the table, something like QOQM helps us to be able to look at, where we're performing, where the benefits are accruing, and to be able to identify specific metrics by the different perspectives that help us make informed decisions about which things we would want to go do first. So QOQM helps us do something very important here. It helps us understand strategic intent. What are the strategic goals and what are the questions that we might want to answer from a strategic perspective to make sure that we're meeting our strategic needs? And then we can use the same approach from an operational perspective. Right? Given a set of operational objectives to deliver on the strategic objectives, what questions will we need to ask and answer? Right? What are the key inputs and outputs that we need? And how do we get some clarity on the things that we actually want to measure? Now, later on downstream, when we get to things like performance measurement, that's where we're going to use these metrics to then drive our actual measures to be able to ascertain performance and to be able to identify whether or not we might need to do certain types of improvement activities. So again, the fundamental principle that we're talking to here is grounded in this idea that strategy and risks are not exclusive. Many boards of directors, many senior governing bodies treat these as separate flows. Right? I have a set of organizational strategies. I have a separate set of policies, generally with a focus toward external legal regulatory rules. Right? Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't have to do those things, right? But more broadly, we want to be able to think about not only what our compliance requirements are, but what do we actually need to do from an organization-wide perspective to effectively best optimize our risk. As we embrace digital business goals, digital business plans, we drive more and more and more of our overall enterprise risk into digital risk. So if we're not making risk-informed decisions about strategy, we're not going to have successful strategies, right? If I create a digital business capability, but I can't suitably protect it, the value that it's supposed to create won't accrue, and it won't effectively happen. So by embracing this broad idea of strategy risk, then, we can use QOQM to establish strategic goals and metrics to be able to assess what key questions we would need to answer from a strategic perspective. And then we can use this to align our operational goals. What particular controls will I need? What particular metrics will I need? What will I need to do to ascertain as an implementer that it's working the way it's supposed to? What would I need to look at as an auditor to be able to validate that it actually does what it's supposed to do? Right? So this allows us to think fundamentally about value from the perspective of each of the relevant stakeholders, whether you be strategic board of directors members, whether you're people establishing metrics, whether you're someone implementing or auditing controls. Right? And then all of this, of course, can be used to trigger different kinds of innovation, some of which might happen inside the existing operating envelope. Innovations that allow us to gain efficiency and effectiveness, or allow us to potentially adapt practices to produce better results for our stakeholders. And then there may be other kinds of innovations that are larger, that will require changes in organizational strategic policies, or even potentially changes in organizational strategy, or even our overall mindset and what business we even think that we're in. Right. And so all of this is then predicated, to serve as an overlay over what you are already doing right now. Right. Your organization probably already uses service management capabilities, governance models, and a number of other things, enterprise risk management frameworks and the like. And so what you want to be able to do is to use models like this as a framework and as an overlay in particular to help identify and prioritize gaps. What are some of the gaps you might see that might then drive changes in our overall approach to things? So all of this is really underpinned by this broad idea called complex systems thinking. And you can Google this and research a lot more about thinking this way. But the long and the short of it is, as all of us are well aware, there's almost always stuff under the hood that affects how things work. Right? We see certain events happen, but then when we start to try to ask harder questions about why it happened and what the underpinning ideas are, we start to see structural underpinnings that are driving certain behaviors. We may even see very specific mental models. This is how we do certain things here, right? That may or may not reinforce the right behaviors that we want. And so you can use a complex systems model to understand the nature of these interactions and these dependencies. And you can use them to identify certain points of leverage, places you could potentially experiment and focus on things that'll improve the overall performance of your system. So this requires a slightly broader approach than we're traditionally used to doing. We tend to isolate things. We tend to look at specific points of a system and establish specific critical success factors and key performance indicators, right? And the problem with this general approach is that there are all kinds of interdependent parts where structures and policies affect functions and practices, affect behaviors of persons, right? And so what this ends up doing is creating these complex interactions that work both ways, right? Where the behaviors then drive actions, then drive policy decisions that drive actions and so forth. And treating them in isolation generally gets us the wrong result. We focus on a particular whole rather than the whole system and how the whole system performs. Right. And so what you want to think about is you want to think about how do I move beyond kind of this linear thinking approach to look more holistically at the interdependent factors, so that you can make informed decisions about prioritization, about where you might spend your energy to go try to drive more value to these things. So the bottom line here is we're asking you to use a different way of thinking about these problems. Right? We have a tendency to think about cybersecurity risk management technically. But of course, fundamentally, this is really about people. It's about practice. It's about culture. Right? So in order to understand and to be able to effectively optimize organizational risk, you have to think through all the different complex interactions that drive how people behave. Right? You can use something like the iceberg model. Right? We have events on top, but underneath all of that, there are various underpinning causes. Many of those may be driven by various structures. Some of those are then reflected in various behaviors that people and systems do. And so when we look at different perspectives, when we look and ask different kinds of questions, we get different points of view. Right? In particular, one of the things that this really specifically does well is it looks at the world from the perspective of someone implementing a control and someone auditing that control. It looks at the perspective of how do I create digital business capabilities and protect them at the same time. Right? And again, we can think of protection holistically there. Right. So if we're using the NIST framework as our approach, how do I identify the things that I have? How do I protect them the best I can? Right. And then how do we think about how we detect when things bypass that? And how do we respond and recover appropriately? I want to best optimize all of this, of course, because we're trying to build resilience. We're trying to establish organizational resilience for how we do these things so that we can do them consistently and reliably over time. So that's kind of a whirlwind summary of what I'm trying to share with you. There is guidance out there. The NIST practitioner guidance, in particular, the Practitioner's Guide to Implementing the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, provides a lot of detail in how these pieces work. There are also certifications, programs, and credentials, the NCSP certification from APMG and others that teach people how to do these things, right? But at the end of the day, this overlay model is particularly compelling to a number of the customers that we've talked to because it doesn't ask us to rip and replace things. It doesn't ask us to adopt another framework or another model. What it does allow us to do, regardless of the size or scale we are, is to have some kind of a functioning overlay so that we can look at what we have. We can do a functional job of gap analysis. We can use things like QOQM to establish better visibility into the key questions that we want to ask and answer so that we can ascertain what metrics and measures we actually care about in order both to meet our strategic goals and to be able to deliver on our operational intent. I hope everybody's enjoying the presentation. If there are any questions from the group, I'm certainly happy to answer those. And if there are no questions at this time, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to review this program, to take the chance to participate in this. Please take your time and read through these slides. Get copies of the slides and dig into them a little bit. Feel free to get a copy of the Practitioner Guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It's a great guide on how to adapt the framework, and it works for any size organization, big or small. So it gives you some flexibility in how you do what you do. So thank you all very, very much. Appreciate everybody's time and attention. Have a great rest of your Stronger